In the autumn of 1943, a transport ship cut through the gray Atlantic carrying men who had already surrendered everything but their lives. They were German soldiers, captured in the deserts of Tunisia or along the coasts of France, and now they stood crowded below deck in a silence broken only by the groan of steel and the whisper of salt water against the hull. Among them was Gefreiter Karl Müller, 24 years old, a mechanic from the Afrika Korps, who had spent 2 years repairing tanks under the North African sun before British forces overran his position and handed him to the Americans. He did not know where the ship was taking him, only that it was moving west, toward a country he had been taught to fear more than death itself. The guards on the ship were distant but professional, neither cruel nor kind, moving through the dim corridors with the efficiency of men doing a job they neither loved nor hated. They did not speak much to the prisoners, and the prisoners did not ask questions, because in the absence of certainty, rumor filled every corner. The whispers spread like fever through the cramped quarters, growing darker with each retelling. The Americans will shoot us when we land, some said. They will work us to death in their factories, said others. They are slaves to the Jews, to money, to a system that grinds men into dust without conscience or mercy. These were not new ideas, but echoes of what they had been told for years, the drumbeat of propaganda that had shaped their understanding of the world long before they ever left Germany. Back home, the posters had been everywhere, bright and venomous, depicting Americans as grotesque caricatures of greed and violence, a nation without soul or honor. Karl had seen them on the walls of barracks, in the pages of newspapers, heard the speeches that painted the enemy as something less than human. He had believed it because belief was easier than doubt, and because everyone around him believed it too. But now, crossing an ocean toward the unknown, belief felt less like certainty and more like a fragile shield, something that might shatter the moment it was tested. The train that carried them inland from the coast moved slowly through a landscape Karl could not reconcile with the stories he had been told. Through the narrow windows, he saw fields that stretched green and endless under the late autumn sun, small towns with white-painted churches and children playing in the yards. As the train passed through one such town, a group of children stopped their game and ran to the tracks, waving not with hatred, but with something that looked almost like curiosity, as if the prisoners were travelers from a distant land rather than enemies to be despised. Karl watched them until the train rounded a bend and they disappeared, and he felt something shift inside him, a small crack in the certainty he had carried across the ocean. They told us we would be killed, he thought, staring at the fields rolling past. Instead, people watch us as if we were ghosts. When the train finally stopped at Camp Shelby in Mississippi, one of the first large prisoner-of-war camps the Americans had built to house the growing number of captured soldiers, Karl stepped onto the platform with legs unsteady from days of travel and a mind burdened by fear he could not name. The camp stretched before him, rows of wooden barracks, surrounded by wire fences and watchtowers, orderly and quiet in the fading afternoon light. He had expected chaos, violence, the brutality that propaganda had promised, but what he found instead was only silence and the distant hum of a generator somewhere beyond the trees. The processing began immediately. The men were deloused, their uniforms taken and replaced with clean prison garb, their names recorded in ledgers by American clerks who worked with the same detached efficiency as the guards on the ship. No one struck them, no one shouted. The routine was mechanical, impersonal, and strangely devoid of malice. Karl moved through it in a daze, following orders he barely heard, his mind still caught between the world he had been promised and the one unfolding around him. By evening, they were led into a long, low building that smelled of wood and soap, a dining hall with rows of tables and benches arranged in neat lines. Karl took his place among the others, silent and watchful, waiting for whatever came next. And then, without warning, he smelled something that stopped him cold, a scent so unexpected and so achingly familiar that for a moment he forgot where he was. It was coffee, rich and bitter and warm, drifting through the air like a memory of peacetime, of mornings before the war, when such things were ordinary and unquestioned. He looked up and saw an American sergeant moving between the tables with a large metal pot, pouring dark liquid into tin cups with the casual ease of a man performing a routine task. He reached Karl's table, filled his cup without a word, and moved on. Karl stared at the cup. Steam rose from its surface, curling into the air, and for the first time since his capture, he felt something other than fear. Karl lifted the cup with hands that trembled slightly, though whether from exhaustion or something else entirely, he could not say. The metal was warm against his palms, almost hot, and the steam that rose from the dark liquid carried with it a fragrance that belonged to another life, one that felt impossibly distant now. He had not tasted real coffee in months, not since the supply lines in North Africa had begun to collapse, and everything they drank became a thin, bitter substitute made from acorns or chicory or whatever could be found. This was different. This smelled like the coffee his mother used to brew on Sunday mornings in their small kitchen in Bavaria, back when the world was still whole and the future seemed like something that could be planned rather than survived. He brought the cup to his lips and hesitated, because accepting it felt like crossing some invisible threshold he did not yet understand. Around him, other men were doing the same, lifting their cups with the slow, cautious movements of people who had learned not to trust unexpected kindness. The hall was nearly silent except for the shuffle of boots on the wooden floor and the quiet clink of metal against wood as cups were set down on tables. No one spoke. No one dared to break the spell of what was happening, this moment that made no sense within the framework of everything they had been taught to expect. Karl took his first sip and felt the heat of it spread through his chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with temperature and everything to do with what the act represented. The coffee was strong, perhaps too strong, with a bitterness that cut through the exhaustion and the fear and left behind something clearer, something almost like clarity. It tasted nothing like the propaganda posters had suggested America would taste. It tasted like civility, like a gesture extended across the vast gulf of war without demand or expectation, and that realization was more unsettling than any cruelty could have been. Across the table, an older soldier named Heinrich sat staring at his cup as if it might contain poison, his weathered face drawn tight with suspicion. He had been a sergeant in the Wehrmacht, a man who had survived the Eastern Front before being transferred to North Africa, and he carried the hardness of those years in every line of his expression. Finally, he lifted the cup and drank, and when he set it down again, his hands were shaking. He looked at Karl with eyes that held something close to bewilderment, and in a voice barely above a whisper, he said what they were all thinking but had not yet found words for. We were prepared to die. Instead, we were given coffee. It was not the coffee itself that mattered, though the taste of it was a small miracle after months of deprivation. It was what the coffee represented, the symbol of it, the fact that their captors had chosen to offer them this most ordinary yet most profound gesture of human consideration. Coffee was not sustenance in the way bread or water was sustenance. It was something more, something that spoke to comfort and normalcy and the quiet rituals of peacetime life. It was what civilized people shared when they sat together and acknowledged each other's humanity. And the Americans had given it to them without ceremony, without speeches about mercy or magnanimity, as if it were simply the natural thing to do. Karl looked toward the front of the hall where the sergeant who had poured the coffee now stood refilling his pot from a large urn, working with the same unhurried efficiency he might have shown in any mess hall anywhere. There was no mockery in his movements. no performance of superiority or conquest. He was simply a man doing his job, and that ordinariness was perhaps the most extraordinary thing of all. Karl had expected his captors to be larger than life, either monsters or saviors, but this man was neither. He was just tired, middle-aged, and indifferent in a way that suggested he had poured coffee for 1,000 men before and would pour it for 1,000 more, and whether they were American or German made no difference to the basic mechanics of the task. "Sugar's on the table," the sergeant had said when he filled Karl's cup, gesturing with his chin toward the small tin containers scattered along the tables. Not an order, not a taunt, just a statement of fact, delivered in a flat Midwestern accent that carried no particular emotion. Karl had not taken any sugar because he could not quite bring himself to believe the offer was real, but now he watched as another prisoner reached for one of the tins and spooned white crystals into his cup with the tentative movements of a man testing the solidity of thin ice. Nothing happened. No one stopped him. No one laughed. The world did not end because a German prisoner sweetened his coffee in an American camp. Around the hall, the silence was beginning to break as men processed what was happening, their voices rising in low murmurs of disbelief and confusion. Some laughed, short and bitter, because laughter was easier than confronting the cognitive dissonance of the moment. Others simply drank in silence, perhaps afraid that speaking would somehow dispel the illusion and return them to the reality they had expected. Karl heard someone behind him say that the coffee was better than anything they had been given by their own supply officers in the final months of the African campaign, and the comment hung in the air like an accusation no one wanted to examine too closely. Karl drank his coffee slowly, making it last, because he understood instinctively that this moment mattered in ways he could not yet articulate. The first sip had burned, shocking his system with its heat and its strength, but the second sip calmed something inside him, settling his nerves and quieting the voice that had whispered of violence and retribution since the moment of his capture. By the third sip, he realized he was no longer afraid, or at least the nature of his fear had changed. He was no longer afraid of what the Americans would do to him. He was afraid of what it meant that they had chosen to do this instead, afraid of the questions that simple cup of coffee raised about everything he had believed and everything he had fought for. The aroma filled the hall, rich and bitter and impossibly civilized, and Karl breathed it in like a man surfacing from deep water. It was the smell of peace, though the war was still raging across oceans and continents. It was the smell of home, though home was thousands of miles away and perhaps no longer existed in any form he would recognize. Most of all, it was the smell of a truth he had not been prepared to face. The truth that his enemies were not the barbarians he had been promised, but simply people who had chosen, in this small way, to treat him as something other than an animal. When he finally set down his empty cup, Karl felt the weight of that truth settle over him like a coat he would wear for the rest of his life.
The days that followed unfolded with the rhythm that felt almost surreal in its ordinariness, as if the war had paused at the gates of Camp Shelby and allowed something else to take root inside the wire. Karl woke each morning to the sound of reveille echoing across the compound, a bugle call that might have belonged to any military installation anywhere in the world, and he dressed in the plain prison uniform that had replaced his dust-stained Afrika Korps fatigues. The fabric was coarse but clean, dyed a dark blue-gray, and across the back of his shirt and down the legs of his trousers were stenciled the letters PW in white paint, each character nearly a foot tall. The marking was required by the Geneva Convention, a visible declaration that he was a prisoner of war, and Karl found himself conscious of it constantly, aware that anyone who saw him would know immediately what he was, before they knew who he was. The barracks were wooden and simple but sturdy, with real beds and mattresses instead of the dirt floors and canvas he had known in the desert. There were showers with hot water, a luxury he had almost forgotten existed, and latrines that were cleaned daily by rotating details of prisoners under guard supervision. The mess halls served 3 meals without fail, and a medical clinic stood near the camp center, where a doctor examined each prisoner with the kind of thoroughness that suggested their health actually mattered to someone. It was the structure of it all that unsettled him most, the way the camp operated like a small, self-contained institution with its own routines and hierarchies and unspoken rules that everyone followed because the alternative was chaos. Every morning, the men were counted and assigned to work details or left to their own devices in the recreation yards, always under the watch of guards who rotated through shifts with mechanical precision. There was a library stocked with books in German and English, magazines that were only a few months old, newspapers that told of the war's progress with a frankness that German publications had long since abandoned. There were sports equipment and musical instruments, chessboards and playing cards, all provided without explanation or fanfare. The Red Cross inspectors came regularly, walking through the compound with clipboards and stern expressions, interviewing prisoners without guards present, ensuring that the Geneva Convention was being observed not just in letter, but in spirit. Karl found himself working in the camp's motor pool, his skills as a mechanic making him valuable even in captivity. The Americans gave him tools that were newer and better maintained than anything he had used in the Afrika Korps, and they paid him for his labor, a small wage, calculated according to the rules laid out in the convention. It was 80 cents a day in canteen coupons, barely enough for cigarettes and chocolate and the occasional newspaper, but the fact that he was paid at all struck him as extraordinary. He watched his account grow week by week at the camp canteen, a tiny accumulation of credit that represented something more than its monetary value. It represented the idea that even in captivity, he was still a person with agency and dignity, not merely a resource to be exploited until exhaustion. The guards at Camp Shelby were younger than he had expected, farm boys and factory workers from places with names like Iowa and Pennsylvania and Oregon, men who had been civilians until recently and who still carried the habits of civilian life in the way they spoke and moved. They maintained their distance as regulations required, supervising work details and conducting inspections with professional detachment, but they were not cruel. Some were even courteous in a formal way, responding to questions about procedure or acknowledging good work with brief nods. Karl noticed that they seemed almost uncomfortable with the power their positions gave them, as if being a prison guard was something they had fallen into rather than chosen. They did their jobs without enthusiasm or malice, counting prisoners and inspecting barracks and filing reports with the weary efficiency of bureaucrats rather than warriors. But it was something Karl observed during a work detail that created the deepest crack in his understanding of the world. The prisoners had been marched under guard to the camp's supply depot to unload a delivery of construction materials, and while waiting for the truck to be positioned, Karl stood with the others in the shade, the large PW on his back visible to anyone passing by. Across the road, he could see 2 separate groups of American soldiers moving equipment, and he realized after several minutes of watching that they were working on the same task but from different areas. One group was composed entirely of white soldiers, the other entirely of black soldiers, and though they were doing identical work, they used different equipment sheds, took breaks in different areas, and at no point did the groups mix or interact beyond the occasional shouted coordination about the movement of heavy machinery.
Karl had been taught that America was weak precisely because it allowed racial mixing, that its strength was an illusion that would crumble under the weight of its own moral decay. Yet what he observed was not mixing, but rigid separation, a kind of segregation that seemed as formally enforced as any hierarchy he had known in Germany. The black soldiers wore the same uniform as the white soldiers,
carried the same rank insignia when he could see them clearly enough, served the same army, yet they existed in parallel worlds that touched but never merged. One of the guards, noticing Karl's attention, mentioned casually that colored troops had their own units and facilities, as if this explained everything and required no further discussion. The contradiction raised questions Karl had no framework to answer. The propaganda had painted America as chaotic and mongrelized, a place where racial boundaries had dissolved and produced weakness, but the evidence before his eyes suggested something more complex and more uncomfortable. There was separation here, formalized and apparently accepted, and it reminded him of the racial hierarchies he had left behind, though the specifics were different and the justifications would surely be expressed in different language. He did not know what to make of this observation, could not fit it neatly into either the propaganda version of America he had been taught or the generous treatment he himself was receiving as a prisoner. The world, it seemed, contained more contradictions than ideology could accommodate. The work at the motor pool continued day after day, and Karl began to notice other details about how the camp functioned. The prisoners were organized by rank even in captivity, with German officers living in separate barracks and receiving certain privileges that reflected their status. When prisoners complained about conditions or treatment, there were formal procedures for addressing grievances that involved written forms and investigation by camp authorities, and sometimes those complaints resulted in actual changes to policy or practice. He watched how the Americans managed the routine tasks of prison administration, how they maintained records with obsessive thoroughness, how they followed procedures even when those procedures seemed inefficient or unnecessary. He saw how Americans queued for meals in their own facilities when he passed near the guards' mess during work details, waiting in orderly lines with patient resignation, how they spoke to each other with a casual politeness that seemed ingrained rather than performed. Even their disagreements, when he overheard them during breaks and supervision, were conducted with a restraint that suggested some deeper social contract he did not fully understand. There was something in their manner, a kind of automatic civility that operated without apparent enforcement, and it puzzled him because it contradicted the image of brutal individualism the propaganda had promised. The letters he wrote home were carefully worded, because he knew they would be censored by both American and German authorities, but he tried to convey something of what he was experiencing without saying too much. "The food is adequate," he wrote, knowing this was a vast understatement given that he was eating better than he had in the final year of the Afrika Korps. "We are treated according to international law," he added, which was true, but missed the larger truth that the Americans seemed to take those laws seriously in a way that surprised him. "We are not being harmed," he concluded, and hoped his family would understand what he could not say directly, that he was safer here, marked with PW and guarded constantly, than he had been in the service of his own country. At night, lying in his bunk while other men snored or whispered in the darkness, Karl felt the weight of what was happening to him, the slow erosion of certainties he had carried since adolescence. The ideology that had shaped his youth was cracking under the pressure of lived reality, and he did not know how to stop it, or even if he wanted to. He had expected to hate his captors, had been prepared for that hatred to sustain him through whatever trials captivity brought. But hatred required fuel, and the Americans were not providing it. Instead, they were offering something far more dangerous, the suggestion that the world was not as he had been told, that the enemy was not monstrous, and that perhaps the real evil had been wearing a different uniform all along. He began to fear not the Americans, but the emptiness of what he had believed, the vast hollow space that was opening inside him where certainty used to live. The camp ran like clockwork, indifferent and efficient, and in its very ordinarity lay the most profound challenge to everything he had once believed. And every morning when he pulled on the prison uniform with its bold white letters marking him as PW, he was reminded that he was being changed by his captivity in ways that had nothing to do with barbed wire or guard towers, but everything to do with the gap between what he had been promised and what he had found.
Winter came to Mississippi with a gentleness that surprised the German prisoners who had known only the bitter cold of European winters or the scorching extremes of the North African desert. The air grew cool but rarely harsh, and the morning frost melted by midday, leaving the ground soft and workable. It was in this season that Karl and several dozen other prisoners were loaded onto trucks and driven beyond the wire to work in the surrounding countryside, assigned to local farms whose owners had lost their laborers to the war effort and needed hands to bring in what remained of the cotton harvest. The work was hard, but not unbearable, and it carried with it something the camp could not provide: contact with the world beyond the fence, with America as it actually existed, rather than as it had been described in propaganda or imagined in fear. The farm where Karl's group was assigned belonged to a man named Fletcher, a lean and weathered figure in his 60s who ran the place with his wife and a single hired hand too old for military service. Fletcher spoke little, directing the prisoners to the fields with economical gestures and watching from a distance as they moved between the rows of cotton plants, their hands working with the mechanical efficiency of men who understood that labor was simply another form of time, something to be endured until it ended. The guards who accompanied them sat in the shade of an oak tree, rifles resting across their laps, occasionally standing to stretch or smoke, but otherwise content to let the day pass without incident. It was Fletcher's wife, a small woman with gray hair pinned back in a practical bun, who first disrupted the careful distance that everyone had maintained. On the third day of their work, she appeared at the edge of the field carrying a large basket, and when the guards called for the mid-morning break, she began unpacking its contents onto a folding table she had set up beneath the trees. There were sandwiches wrapped in waxed paper, apples from her own orchard, and a thermos of coffee that she poured into tin cups with the same matter-of-fact efficiency Karl had seen in the camp sergeant weeks earlier. She did not make a speech or explain her actions, simply gestured for the prisoners to come and eat, calling them over with a wave of her hand as if they were hired workers rather than enemy soldiers. "The boys are probably hungry," she said to one of the guards, and the guard nodded and told the prisoners they could approach. Karl took a sandwich and a cup of coffee, mumbling his thanks in broken English, and the woman smiled briefly before turning to serve the next man in line. She called them the boys, a term that stripped away nationality and ideology and reduced them to something simpler and more universal. They were just young men far from home, and she was a woman who had perhaps raised sons of her own and understood hunger when she saw it. The sandwich was thick with ham and cheese, more generous than it needed to be, and Karl ate it slowly while sitting on the ground with his back against a fence post. The other prisoners ate in silence, their faces showing the same mixture of gratitude and confusion that Karl felt. This was not required of her. The Geneva Convention mandated adequate food for prisoners, but it said nothing about farm wives bringing homemade lunches to the fields, nothing about coffee served from a family thermos or apples picked from a private orchard. This was something else, something that existed outside the formal rules of war and captivity, and it created an obligation that none of them knew how to repay. As the weeks passed, the routine continued. Fletcher's wife appeared regularly with her basket, sometimes bringing pie still warm from the oven, other times offering cold lemonade on the rare days when the temperature rose above comfortable. She began to learn their names, or at least approximate them, calling Karl by something that sounded like Karl and addressing the others with the same casual friendliness she might have shown to any workers on her land. And slowly, cautiously, the prisoners began to respond, offering small gestures of their own. They worked harder than they were required to, taking care with the crops and repairing a broken section of fence without being asked. They carved small wooden figures during their breaks, simple toys and decorations made from scrap wood, and left them on the table as anonymous gifts. It was during one of these breaks that Karl met Private Joseph Grant, one of the guards assigned to their detail. Grant was younger than most of the other guards, perhaps 22 or 23, with the kind of open, unremarkable face that suggested Middle America and an uncomplicated life. He had been watching Karl examine the engine of Fletcher's old tractor, a machine that had been running poorly for days, and finally he stood and walked over with the casual confidence of a man who knew his way around mechanical problems. "You know engines," Grant said, and it was not quite a question. Karl nodded, still wary but curious. "Afrika Korps," he replied, the words coming out awkward in his accented English. "Mechanic. Tanks. Trucks." Grant smiled and pulled a wrench from his belt, handing it to Karl with a gesture that suggested this was the natural thing to do when two mechanics encountered a broken machine. They worked together for the next hour, speaking in the limited vocabulary of technical problems and practical solutions, a language that transcended nationality and required no ideology. Grant was from Ohio, he explained, had worked in his father's garage before the war, specialized in farm equipment and the kind of vehicles that kept rural America moving. Karl described the tanks he had maintained in North Africa, the constant battle against sand and heat and the shortage of parts that had made every repair a small miracle of improvisation. When they finally got the tractor running again, its engine settling into a steady rhythm that suggested it would last at least a few more seasons, Grant clapped Karl on the shoulder with unthinking camaraderie. "Good work," he said, and then seemed to realize what he had done, his hand freezing in place for a moment before he withdrew it awkwardly. But Karl had felt it, that brief moment of connection between two men who shared a skill and a satisfaction in work done well, and it stayed with him long after they returned to their respective positions on opposite sides of the invisible line that separated captor from captive. He handed me his wrench as if I were a man, not an enemy, Karl thought that night, lying in his bunk and replaying the moment in his mind. The gesture had been so natural, so devoid of calculation or performance, that it had slipped past his defenses before he could guard against it. And in that carelessness lay something dangerous, the possibility of connection that made the war feel less absolute, less justified, less like the cosmic struggle between good and evil he had been raised to believe in. The human fracture was opening wider, and Karl no longer knew which side of it he belonged on, or whether such sides had ever really existed at all.
Spring came to Camp Shelby in 1945 with a riot of color that seemed incongruous against the gray weight of what was happening across the ocean. Dogwood trees bloomed white and pink along the camp's perimeter, wildflowers pushed through the warming earth, and the air carried the scent of new growth and possibility. But inside the wire, a different kind of awakening was beginning, one that had nothing to do with seasonal renewal and everything to do with the slow, terrible unveiling of truth. The war in Europe was ending, collapsing inward on itself as Allied forces pushed from both east and west. And with that collapse came news that would shatter whatever remained of the world Karl and his fellow prisoners had once believed in. The first rumors reached them through whispers and fragments, stories so extreme that they seemed designed to be dismissed as propaganda, as the kind of exaggeration that all sides employed to justify their continued fighting. American forces had liberated a camp in Germany, the rumors said, but not a prisoner of war camp like Shelby. Something else, something worse. The details were vague and contradictory, filtered through multiple languages and the natural distortion that comes when terrible information passes from mouth to mouth. But the essential claim remained consistent. The Germans had built camps not for military prisoners, but for civilians, and what had been done in those camps defied comprehension. Karl refused to believe it at first,
And he was not alone in his refusal. The men gathered in small groups during recreation time and spoke in low, defensive tones about Allied propaganda, about how every side in every war claimed the other was guilty of atrocities. They had heard stories about German crimes before, exaggerated tales meant to demoralize them or justify the Allied cause, and they had learned to discount such claims as the inevitable byproduct of conflict. This was surely more of the same, they told each other. Lies designed to make them doubt their own country and accept their defeat as morally necessary, rather than merely a matter of military misfortune. But then the guards came with photographs, and everything changed. It happened on a mild April morning, when the usual routine was interrupted by an announcement that all prisoners were to assemble in the main recreation hall. They filed in with the curiosity and mild apprehension that any break in routine provoked, taking their seats on the wooden benches while guards stood along the walls with expressions that suggested something significant was about to occur. An American officer Karl had not seen before, a colonel with gray hair and the bearing of a man who had seen too much, stood at the front of the room beside a projector that had been set up facing a white sheet hung from the ceiling. The colonel spoke briefly in English, his words translated by a German-speaking sergeant, and what he said was simple and terrible. The war was nearly over. Germany would lose. But before that happened, the prisoners needed to understand what they had been fighting for, what their country had done in their name while they were away fighting on distant fronts. What they were about to see, he said, were photographs taken by American and British forces at camps they had liberated in recent weeks. He did not use the word concentration camp because he did not need to. The images would speak for themselves. The lights dimmed and the first photograph appeared on the screen, and in that moment, something broke inside the room that would never be repaired. Karl saw bodies, more bodies than he could count, piled like cordwood in open pits. He saw faces that were nothing but skull and skin, eyes that stared at nothing, limbs reduced to bones wrapped in gray flesh. He saw striped uniforms hanging on frames that barely resembled human beings, barracks filled with the dying and the dead, crematorium ovens still containing the remains of those who had been burned. The photographs cycled past with mechanical precision, each one worse than the last, each one a hammer blow against the fortress of denial he had been constructing since the first rumors reached him. Buchenwald, the colonel said, Dachau, Bergen-Belsen, names that meant nothing yet but would echo through history as markers of humanity's capacity for evil. The hall filled with a silence so profound it seemed to have weight and texture, a silence born not from absence of sound, but from the death of language itself, from the recognition that no words existed adequate to what they were seeing. Some men turned away, unable to look, but the guards did not force them. Some wept openly, their shoulders shaking with sobs they could not control. Others sat frozen, their faces blank with shock, their minds struggling to reconcile the images on the screen with the country they had loved and served and believed in. Karl simply stared, his hands gripped white-knuckled on the edge of the bench, feeling something collapse inside him that he would spend the rest of his life trying to rebuild. When the photographs ended and the lights came back on, no one moved. The colonel spoke again, telling them that newspapers with full reports would be available in German translation, that those who wanted more information could request it, that this was not propaganda, but documented fact, verified by multiple sources, including the Red Cross and neutral observers. Then he left, and the guards followed, and the prisoners were left alone with what they had seen. The arguments began almost immediately. Desperate attempts to salvage something from the wreckage of belief. It was faked, some insisted, elaborate forgeries designed to break their morale. It was exaggerated, others claimed, isolated incidents blown out of proportion. It was the work of a few criminals, not representative of Germany as a whole. But even as they made these arguments, Karl could hear the hollowness in their voices, the desperation of men clinging to a sinking ship. He said nothing, because he had no arguments left to make. He remembered the propaganda posters, the speeches about racial purity, and the necessity of eliminating enemies of the state. He remembered the casual cruelty he had witnessed even in the regular army, the way certain people were spoken about as if they were vermin rather than human beings. He remembered believing it was all justified, necessary, part of some greater struggle for Germany's survival. And now he understood what that belief had built, what it had permitted, what it had made inevitable. In the days that followed, more information arrived. Newspapers printed accounts from correspondents who entered the camps, testimonies from survivors who described years of starvation and torture and systematic murder. The numbers were incomprehensible, millions dead, entire communities erased, an industrial approach to genocide that seemed to belong to some future nightmare rather than contemporary reality. Karl read the articles with the grim determination of a man examining evidence of his own complicity, because even though he had never set foot in those camps, had never directly participated in what happened there, he had been part of the system that made them possible. He had worn the uniform, had fought the battles, and believed the lies that justified it all. The same Americans who showed mercy to him, who gave him coffee and paid him wages and treated him with dignity despite having every reason to hate him. These were the men who had fought to stop what his country had done. The irony was crushing. His enemies had been more moral, more humane, more worthy of respect than the regime he had served. They had defeated Germany not out of barbarity, but out of necessity, not to enslave, but to liberate. And in their victory lay his nation's only hope for redemption. He remembered the smell of coffee on that first morning in camp, the simple gesture that had seemed so extraordinary after weeks of fear and propaganda. That first cup was not mercy, he thought. It was judgment. It showed us who we were and who they chose to be. The Americans had extended humanity to him when they had no obligation to do so, had treated him as something worth saving, even after discovering what his country had done. And that generosity, that refusal to respond to atrocity with equal brutality, was perhaps the most damning verdict of all. It proved that decency was possible, that even in war, there were choices about how to treat the defeated, and that Germany had made the wrong choice at every turn. Karl sat alone in the spring sunshine during recreation time, holding a newspaper he could no longer read because the words blurred through the tears he could not stop. Around him, other men sat in similar isolation, each processing grief and shame in his own way. Some would never accept what they had learned, would spend the rest of their lives insisting it had all been lies. But Karl knew better. He had seen too much, felt too much, understood too much. The world was not as he had been told. The enemy had not been the monster. And in that recognition lay a burden he would carry until the day he died. The coffee had been the first crack in the wall of lies. These photographs had brought the entire structure down.
The ship that carried Karl Müller back to Germany in the autumn of 1946 moved through calm seas under gray skies that seemed to mirror the emotional landscape of the men crowded on its decks. They were going home, or at least to the place that had once been home, though none of them could say with certainty what they would find when they arrived. The war had been over for more than a year, but its aftermath stretched ahead like a long shadow, reshaping everything it touched. Karl stood at the railing and watched the coastline of America recede into the distance, and with it went 3 years of his life that had changed him in ways he was only beginning to understand. The Germany he returned to was unrecognizable,
a landscape of rubble and despair that bore little resemblance to the country he had left as a young soldier, full of conviction and purpose. Cities lay in ruins, their buildings reduced to hollow shells and mountains of broken stone. Refugees moved along the roads in endless columns, carrying whatever they could salvage from lives that had been shattered beyond repair. Hunger was everywhere, a constant companion that gnawed at bodies already weakened by years of deprivation. The occupation forces had divided the country into zones, each administered by a different allied power, and the future was uncertain in a way that made planning beyond the next day feel like an act of dangerous optimism. Karl made his way back to Bavaria, to the small town where his family had lived, traveling by foot and by hitching rides on military trucks when he could. What he found there was both more and less than he had feared. His parents were alive, older and thinner, but intact, living in the same house, though half of it had been damaged by bombing and remained unrepaired. His younger sister had survived as well, though she would not speak of what the final years of the war had been like, and Karl did not press her. Some stories were too heavy to tell, and some silences were more merciful than words. He tried to explain to them what he had experienced in America, the strange contradiction of being treated well by an enemy he had been taught to hate, but the words came out inadequate and incomplete. How could he describe the taste of that first cup of coffee, the weight of kindness extended without condition, the slow erosion of certainty that had rebuilt him from the inside out? His father listened in silence, nodding occasionally, and when Karl finished his halting explanation, the old man simply said that perhaps it was good he had been captured by the Americans rather than the Russians, and left it at that. There were some truths too complex to fit into the vocabulary of survival that occupied everyone in those years. Karl found work at a garage on the edge of town, a place that repaired whatever vehicles still functioned in a country where gasoline was scarce and spare parts were luxuries. The owner was a man named Schmidt, a former Luftwaffe mechanic who had lost an arm during the war and now ran his business with grim efficiency and few questions about anyone's past. They worked side by side in near silence, speaking only when necessary to coordinate repairs. And in that silence, Karl found something close to peace. The work was honest, the problems were concrete, and at the end of each day, he had fixed something that had been broken, which felt like a small redemption in a world that needed more fixing than any amount of labor could provide. He saved what money he could, and after 2 years, he had enough to open his own small repair shop in a building that had once been a bakery before the war. It was modest, just a single bay with basic tools and a hand-painted sign that read Müller Reparaturen in simple black letters. He specialized in farm equipment, the tractors and machines that were essential to feeding a population still struggling with scarcity, and his reputation grew slowly but steadily among the local farmers who appreciated his skill and his fair prices. Every morning before opening the shop, Karl brewed coffee. It was a ritual he had begun shortly after returning to Germany and had maintained without fail ever since. He used an old percolator he had found at a market, grounds he bought when he could afford them, or substitutes when he could not, and he poured the coffee into a chipped ceramic cup that had survived the war when so much else had not. The smell of it filled the small shop, rich and bitter and achingly familiar, and as he stood drinking it in the quiet of early morning, he allowed himself to remember. He remembered the dining hall at Camp Shelby, the steam rising from tin cups, the silence of men confronting a truth they had not expected. He remembered Fletcher's wife and her basket of sandwiches, the casual generosity of a woman who called them the boys and meant it. He remembered Private Joseph Grant handing him a wrench as if it were the most natural thing in the world for 2 mechanics to work together, regardless of the uniforms they wore. And he remembered the photographs, the terrible evidence that had shattered his world and forced him to rebuild it on a foundation of uncomfortable truths rather than comfortable lies. When younger men came to apprentice at his shop, Germans who had been children during the war and were now learning trades in a country trying to reinvent itself, Karl treated them with the same patient attention that Grant had shown him. He taught them not just the mechanics of repair, but something else, something harder to quantify. He taught them by example that strength did not require cruelty, that discipline did not require brutality, that it was possible to maintain standards without dehumanizing those who fell short of them. And sometimes, when the opportunity arose naturally, he told them about his time in America. "They defeated us without hate," he would say, his hands steady on whatever part he was examining, his voice matter of fact. "They could have been cruel. They had reason to be, but they chose something else instead." The younger men would listen with expressions that suggested they weren't quite sure what to make of this information, whether it was wisdom or simply the reminiscence of an old soldier trying to find meaning in his memories. But Karl did not need them to understand immediately. He had learned that some lessons took years to sink in. The truth worked slowly, eroding false certainty the way water wore away stone. He simply wanted to plant the seed, to suggest that there were alternatives to the violence and ideology that had consumed their parents' generation. The years passed, measured in repaired engines and apprentices trained and coffee brewed each morning. Germany rebuilt itself around him, rising from the rubble with a determination born of necessity and shaped by the occupation forces who insisted on different values, different structures, different ways of organizing society. The Marshall Plan brought aid and investment. The Constitution that was written emphasized human rights and democratic principles, and slowly the country began to transform itself into something that would have been unrecognizable to the regime Karl had served as a young soldier.